The world is changed.
I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it.
The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are a series of books created by the intellectual giant J.R.R Tolkien. These books have had a profound impact on pop culture, and this was especially the case when they were created into visually stunning movies in the early 2000s. Many people are aware of Tolkien's faith as a Catholic, but what many people don't usually know is the amount of influence that his faith had upon his book, The Lord of the Rings. In fact, it had so much impact that I'm inclined to say The Lord of the Rings is a Catholic book. Now, for those who are familiar with the Catholic influence on Tolkien's works, you may ask, what is the reason for pointing this fact out? And the answer to this question is twofold. Namely, once one understands the Catholic influence on The Lord of the Rings, understanding moral and societal themes throughout his works makes much more sense, since these themes are not simply abstract concepts totally ripped out of a theistic or Catholic tradition and then thrown into a secular world. And secondly, it is this very secular world which tries to interpret Tolkien in such a manner that his works are merely secular or don't have much to do with Catholicism. Therefore, it is of importance that we defend Tolkien and his works against the errors of modernism, which he so wrote against in his various books and letters. Let us therefore briefly start with Tolkien himself. J.R.R Tolkien was born in 1892 and lived in a generally Protestant family. It wasn't until less than a decade later his mother became Roman Catholic. She unfortunately passed at a young age, and Tolkien was sent to live with a Catholic priest. In fact, while speaking of his mother, Tolkien wrote, "My own dear mother was a martyr indeed, and it is not to everybody that God grants so easy a way to his great gifts, as he did to Hilary and myself, giving us a mother who killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith." His mother's impact on his faith was clearly profound, and it would be this faith that Tolkien would go on to implement in the world of The Lord of the Rings. In fact, Tolkien once wrote, "The Lord of the Rings is of course a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in, or have cut out, practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story in the symbolism." Of course, some might be confused by Tolkien's words, as Tolkien says in his letter that he left or cut out any explicit references to religion or religious practices. But right before that, he goes on to talk about how this work of The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So, how is this possible if Tolkien doesn't reference the idea of religion in The Lord of the Rings? Well, Tolkien himself gives us this answer, for he does it in a twofold manner. One is through the absorption of religion in the story elements, and secondly through symbolism. As a side note, if you want to help support me, consider buying my new released merchandise, which is based on St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you for any support. Look no further to Tolkien's view of divine providence, where God providentially governs the world of The Lord of the Rings. In fact, even though God allows evil to occur, such as the figures of Sauron and Morgoth and their wrath on Middle-earth, God still permits it in his plan to bring out a greater good. For, he writes, "In The Lord of the Rings, the conflict is not basically about freedom, though that is naturally involved. It is about God, and his sole right to divine honor. The Eldar and the Númenóreans believed in the one, the true God, and held worship of any other person an abomination." Now, this idea of God's providence is essential to Catholic theology concerning the goodness of God and the problem of evil. In fact, following the same idea of how God permits evil for a greater good, St. Thomas, quoting St. Augustine, writes, as St. Augustine says, "Since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works, unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist, and out of it produce good." Another innate concept in The Lord of the Rings is the idea of monarchy, and how it was the best societal structure. For example, Minas Tirith, which is the capital of Gondor, is described as a city which is in decay, for this very city is without a king, and instead is ruled by an immoral steward, whose job is to defend the city until there is the return of the true king. Now, as the theologian and angelic doctor St. Thomas Aquinas argues, it is natural for man to be ruled by one person. Wherefore he states, again, whatever is in accord with nature is best, for in all things nature does what is best. Now, every natural governance is governance by one. And he continues further, and if a just government is in the hands of one man alone, he is properly called a king. Now, kingship is sharply contrasted with the antagonist of the Lord of the Rings, which is Sauron, who above all desires power. And for St. Thomas, this system is not called a kingship, but a tyranny. St. Thomas writes, since a tyrant, despising the common good, seeks his private interest, it follows that he will oppress his subjects in different ways according as he is dominated by different passions to acquire certain goods. Tolkien therefore embodies this tradition within The Lord of the Rings. In fact, Tolkien sees this returning of kingship in Gondor to a returning of the Catholic Empire by Charlemagne the Great. He writes, the progress of the tale ends in what is far more like the re-establishment of an effective Holy Roman Empire, with its seat in Rome. Finally, as mentioned earlier, Tolkien has certain Catholic symbols throughout his work. For example, Lady Galadriel partially symbolizes the Blessed Mother Mary. Tolkien writes, I was particularly interested in your remarks about Galadriel. I think it is true that I owe much of this character to Christian and Catholic teaching and imagination about Mary. As well, Tolkien acknowledges the fact that lembas bread can be seen as a type of Eucharist, especially since it gives more strength to those who rely on it alone. And of course, there is the idea of the ring as being a source of temptation for Frodo. With this, I conclude that Tolkien's wonderful work of The Lord of the Rings is clearly Catholic, for in his own very words, it is a fundamentally Catholic work. Therefore, since we are human, we ourselves have many rings that we must bear in this life. Therefore, we must follow the wise words of Gandalf that the first Lord of the Rings movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, captures beautifully.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. As always, God bless.